So I spent some years with a lot of faith in technology and science to explain it all. But I began to realize that this actually wasn't a knowledge problem as much as a problem in how we've created and structured our systems. And an example of that, imagine you're a country and you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be for your energy minister and your transportation minister. There's going to be some big costs that are going to fall to them. And the health minister is going to reap all kinds of improvements. People will be healthier. The costs required for hospital systems will go down because of less air pollution, less days of, new diseases. All those things are on one silo in the system, and yet most governments are not uniting their energy, transportation, and health ministers into one conversation. And so a lot of this potential never gets realized because of how decisions are made and how we structured systems. So I got more and more interested in how could we do that differently.
Welcome to Entangled World, where we explore our interrelated existential, social, economic, ecological, and technological challenges, their underlying drivers, and how a more beautiful world might emerge. I'm your host, Najia Shaukat Lepson. I'm a daughter of Pakistani Muslim immigrants, a mom, and an intersystems thinker. Join me on a journey to discover what is uniquely and meaningfully ours to do at this pivotal moment in time in service to the sacredness of life. Quick note before we get started, if you haven't already listened to the first full episode of this podcast called What is the Metacrisis? I highly recommend you go back and listen to that first. It's really a foundational episode that provides a lot of the grounding that is important for all the episodes that follow. Today on the podcast, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Sawin, director of the Multisolving Institute, which she founded in 2021 to develop tools and share research on multisolving. This approach addresses equity, climate change, health, well-being, and economic vitality as interconnected issues, helping to create solutions that tackle multiple problems simultaneously. Elizabeth developed this concept after studying successful bright spots around the world, places where people brought about systems change by breaking down silos and building connections. Elizabeth's background is rooted in system dynamics and computer simulation, a field in which she was mentored by the renowned Donella Meadows at the Sustainability Institute. And before founding the Multisolving Institute, Elizabeth co-founded the think tank Climate Interactive, where she and her team developed tools to help navigate the complexities of the climate system. Her work has been widely covered, including in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she has a forthcoming book called Multisolving: Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World. It's an inspiring and practical read that I highly recommend to anyone interested in systems change work. In our conversation, we explore Elizabeth's groundbreaking work in multisolving, where she shares real-world examples of how this approach works in practice, such as bringing together asthma advocates and environmentalists to craft holistic solutions for communities. We also dive into the essential worldview shift that Elizabeth and I believe is necessary for meaningful change. The dominant worldview, particularly in the Western world, treats the world as a collection of objects where safety comes from domination, power is gained through control, and causality is viewed as linear. In contrast, the relational worldview, often associated with indigenous traditions, sees the world as a web of interconnected relationships. In this worldview, safety comes from partnership. Power is built through consent, and boundaries are fluid and permeable. Elizabeth emphasizes that to transform the physical world, we must first transform our mental models, learning to recognize and act within this web of relationships. And one of the most thought-provoking aspects of our discussion is the idea of fractals, how patterns that repeat in nature also appear in societal structures. Elizabeth explains how the collection of objects worldview manifests fractally in systems like supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, and extractive economics. On the other hand, the relational worldview gives rise to fractals of rights for nature, gender and racial equity, and sustainable economies. These patterns reinforce each other, so our work involves breaking harmful patterns and forging new relationships through which healthier, more sustainable fractals can emerge. This was a wonderful and insightful conversation as we explored how systems thinking, multi-solving, and fractals can guide us toward a more regenerative and equitable future. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you do, please subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app, or subscribe to the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being on the Entangled World podcast.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to reconnect with you. I knew we were just talking offline about when we had connected a couple years ago, and your conversation was a really important one for me as I was on a journey to, at that time, I was really digging into climate change and trying to understand what really was at the root of climate change. And I had just started to come to see how it was intersecting with many other global crises that we face in the world. And I just remember your conversation was one that really helped kind of push me a little bit further on my journey. So I'm excited to have you on the podcast now and to continue our conversation and talk about how your thinking has evolved a bit.
Yeah, really happy to be here. And for my part, I remember that conversation too, and I remember the feeling of you being on an interesting journey. So to see that it's created the Entangled World podcast and where you've landed, I'm really interested to connect again. So looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, let's just start with getting to know you a little bit more for our listeners. So, what's your story? How have you kind of come to do the work that you do?
Oh, it's always so hard to know where to start a story like this, but I'll start actually in the dark, in a temperature controlled room at MIT, where I was a graduate student studying neurobiology and I was doing microscopy. That's the dark and the cold were to facilitate that. I remember I was probably 3/4 of the way through a 7-year PhD, and I realized I wasn't going to keep doing this in the way that I had always thought I would. I thought I would be a researcher, run a lab. I loved the organism I studied and the questions. But there's another thing going on in my life, which was in my free time, weekends and evenings, I was volunteering for groups that were working on nuclear disarmament and global environmental issues. And that moment in the dark, I was like, actually, these issues are so critical for everything that I care about. Um, and so much has been invested in me at this point as a young person with a lot of privilege and education. I need to find a way to dedicate what skills I have to those issues. And I really didn't know what that meant. And I was far enough into things that I continued. I completed my degree. Um, but along the way, I had an encounter with someone who became my mentor, and that's Donella Meadows, who was one of the authors of The Limits to Growth back in 1972. So all these issues that we now call maybe the poly crisis or the meta crisis, Donella and her colleagues were anticipating that from decades prior. Their question was, when the human economy crosses over the carrying capacity of the planet, what could happen and what are scenarios for that approach to that carrying capacity? Because from that vantage point, 1972, that was off in the distance. We now know with hindsight around 1988 is the best guess of when that line got crossed. And ever since, we've been in what systems theorists call overshoot, beyond the sustainable nurturing capacity of the planet. Uh, so Donella was starting a research institute, and she called it Sustainability Institute in the late 1990s. And she scooped up a handful of young people with different skill sets, and we became her first team at that institute. Um, and I thought I would have many years to learn from her and with her and her approach, which is system dynamics and computer simulation and systems thinking. And then many of your listeners probably know that Donella died way too young, tragically early, just a few years after I started working with her. But that that big turn in my life, and her willingness to take a chance that a neurobiologist could learn how to build computer models about complex systems really set forth all the rest of my work. It also influenced where I live. So we're talking today from my home in Vermont, where I live in an eco village called Cobb Hill. And Donella was a founding force behind that eco village. So her vision was an institute, an organic farm, and a cooperative living community. So I still live there. We celebrated our 20-year anniversary not long ago. My kids grew up here. So everything changed for me really in that moment. That led, I did learn how to build computer simulations of complex systems. And the real goal behind that was it's challenging for the human brain to comprehend this unfathomable complexity of Earth systems, human systems, and certainly the interaction between the two. And so we can mathematically capture some of that complexity and build what our field calls better mental models. Understand the interconnections, and then the goal is to make more effective choices for long-term well-being. So that work led to all sorts of interesting places. My colleagues and I were able to use tools like that to support people in government, like the U.S. State Department or the Chinese climate negotiating team. We did a fair amount of work at UN climate conferences. Eventually, that formed into an organization called Climate Interactive, where I was the co-founder and co-director for around a decade. Climate Interactive continues that work today, but I picked up another thread along the way at Climate Interactive, partly because I was feeling frustrated by the ability within that frame of the UN climate conferences of societies to make change at the rate that all our modeling was said was needed. And I came to think of that frame as a carbon-centric frame that, in general, I spent most of my time helping people think about CO2. If we're being expansive, we added in the other important greenhouse gases like methane and other gases. But there's this vast complexity of our economy and of the planet, and we were really focused in on just this like very tiny little laser focus on the core of climate change. And of course, that's important. But I realized that there was a lot that was being left out of the conversation. And I thought that was getting in the way of finding solutions. So I started to get interested in the question, what else would get better if the world got off of fossil fuels? And I hired a researcher. Her name was Diana Wright, to look into that question. I asked her to give me a report. And she came back with a report, and she said, it looks like if the world got off of fossil fuels, probably economically that would about pay for itself. And I remember it was a moment of cognitive dissonance. And so this is the best researcher I knew. And I said, I think you might have a decimal point in the wrong place. Like, how can this be? This is like much more well known today. Now the World Health Organization every year puts out a report that says the health savings alone of reduced air pollution would about equal the cost of a transition to a zero carbon economy. But back then, this was still kind of certainly a new and radical idea to me. And that kind of shaped a lot of my work for a while, because I thought, okay, people just need to know this number or this, they need to understand that actually, did you guys know like this will pay for itself? And so I spent some years with a lot of faith in technology and science to explain it all. But I began to realize that this actually wasn't a knowledge problem as much as a problem in how we've created and structured our systems. And an example of that, imagine you're a country and you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be for your energy minister and your transportation minister. There's going to be some big costs that are going to fall to them. And the health minister is going to reap all kinds of improvements. People will be healthier. The costs required for hospital systems will go down because of less air pollution, less days of um, uh, uh, new diseases, all those things are on one silo in the system. And yet most governments are not uniting their energy, transportation, and health ministers into one conversation. And so a lot of this potential never gets realized because of how decisions are made and how we've structured systems. So I got more and more interested in how could we do that differently. And my colleagues and I began to look for bright spots, which we found everywhere we looked. They were rare, but seemed to be everywhere. And they were places where people somehow transcended those barriers and were able to find those solutions that addressed multiple goals at the same time. I really learned from those projects, and that gave us this idea that today we talk about as multi-solving. So actions, investments, collaboratives that address multiple problems at the same time. And since then, in the last 10 years or so, my colleagues and I have mostly been trying to understand how that happens, sometimes by working together on projects like that with people who are multi-solving, sometimes a bit more as social scientists who do research and ask multi-solvers how they work. And a little more than 2 years ago, that work spun out of Climate Interactive and became a freestanding organization called Multisolving Institute. And our goals are mostly to lift up and support the people all over the world who are taking this approach. We call multi-solving a hidden movement, that many people actually are doing it, but they don't see the patterns and they don't necessarily understand there's a lot of people like them. And so we think there's way more chance for people to learn from one another, to share what's working, to not have to reinvent the wheel every time. And that's some of the current questions in front of us. And some of our research and development is on tools that make it easier for people to work in this way. Most of us are getting by with tools made for a siloed world, and we're trying to work in an interconnected world. So we think part of our assignment at Multisolving Institute is to listen to those people working in that interconnected way. What do they need? And trying our best to give them things that make it a little easier.
Yeah, and I love that the work that you're doing, you're really thinking about it in an applied, practical way, like these tools that you've created, and we'll dig into that in a little bit. But I love how sort of the approach is really practical, and anybody that's working in any field can really begin to start thinking in these kinds of ways. But before we dig into multi-solving, I actually want to kind of zoom out a little bit and ask a pretty broad question, and you can take it in any direction that you want. But I'm curious to hear, after all the years of work that you've done in the climate space and in obviously other areas with the multi-solving work, what have you come to see as the root causes of many of our global crises?
Yeah. Well, I spent a fair bit of time, this time not in the dark, but in a quiet place, which is my writing cabin, um, getting my own thoughts clear about that. And I was forced to do that because I wrote a book about multi solving, and it's coming out in just a couple months. And part of what I felt the challenge of that book was to give my answer to that question. Like, what is that? What is at the root of all of this? Because, again, from that very practical vein, we need to understand what's at the root if we're going to take effective action together. Um, the simplest way that I could um, describe where I came to in that process of thinking and writing is that the dominant institutions of our world and the dominant cultures, certainly not all cultures, not all people, but the ones with a lot of power to shape the future right now, are operating out of what in systems theory people call worldviews. Sometimes people use the words paradigm, are operating out of worldviews that don't actually match how the world works. And that's never going to lead to very good results, right? If our assumptions are that things are finite and disconnected and there for us to take, and the world is actually, if our assumption is everything is infinite and the world is actually finite, if we think it's separate and the world is actually interconnected, again and again, the things that we do are going to produce negative outcomes. It's going to take a while, and it's been taking, depending on when you start thinking about, is it colonization? Is it the beginning of patriarchy? We're talking hundreds of years of kind of an experiment that doesn't really match the world. And we're reaping the results of that experiment. I came to think about this as actually an ongoing and currently occurring battle of two different worldviews. And I borrowed names for those from different thinkers. For the one that I think is at the heart of so much damage, I use words from Thomas Berry, the eco-theologian. He talks about the collection of objects worldview. So in that worldview, and Joanna Macy talks about that worldview as we're all billiard balls kind of bouncing off of each other, people and nature, these separate entities that just kind of clatter around. I contrasted that with the phrase a web of relationship worldview. And I think if we look around the world, people are operating out of both of those all the time. And I believe that the real kind of balance of what the future is going to look like is which of those patterns gets the most energy put into it, which gets disrupted. And I think even in our, in an individual life, I know I experience this. I can see how I move in and out of those two patterns, in the organization I lead, in my family, with my garden. I can be oriented toward relationships, really listening, asking consent. And sometimes, because like most of us, I've been socialized in that collection of objects worldview, I can do different versions of power over or domination, which are the kind of main or key, I guess, modes of operation in that collection of objects worldview. Maybe I'll say one more thing and then see if you have questions about any of that. The other thing that I really started thinking about a lot and working on the book is the concept of fractals, which is important in complexity theory. And fractals are when there are self-similar patterns that you see repeated across different domains. And we're all familiar with this, like the silhouette of a tree in winter without leaves is a fractal. The angle of the branches is the same at every angle, whether it's the branches at the tip or the ones closer to the trunk. And if you have two different species of trees, they're internally self-similar, but they look really different from each other. So that's self-similarity. And I think with these worldviews, collection of objects versus web of relationships, there is that kind of fractal self-similarity. And a few years ago in the US, there was a moment that became really clear to me because at the same time we were having some movements that were being encapsulated in hashtags, right? We had the Me Too movement, which was about gender equity. We had Black Lives Matter about racial equity. And we had water is life movement about extraction versus being in relationship with nature. And there were a few cartoons, like editorial cartoons circulating at the time. And one of them I saw was a picture of the Earth with a black eye, and the Earth was holding a sign. The little cartoon Earth had a sign, and it said, "Me too," hashtag Me Too. Right? And that's, we feel that in our bodies, right? That fractal self-similarity between how the dominant culture treats women, how it treats people of racial minorities, and how it treats the Earth. So in that collection of objects worldview, somehow you end up with patriarchy, you end up with white supremacy, you end up with extractive economics, and they're fractal shadows of each other. And in the web of relationship worldview, you end up with striving for gender equity, for racial equity, for the rights of nature and some different relationship to the earth. And so I started to see, in trying to just get my own thinking straight on all of this, how each of those fractal pieces supports one another. And I came to really feel like there's no way to address climate change, and set aside gender equity and racial equity, because these are patterns that go so deep and they reinforce each other so much.
That's so interesting. So I've thought quite a lot about the worldview, this sort of worldview of separation, domination versus the, what some people call an indigenous worldview or a worldview of relationality. And it's interesting because I actually think it was Donella Meadows' work that first got me really thinking deeply about that, because I had come across her writing about, the sort of levers to intervene in a system and the levers for change that, she kind of had sequenced them, which I was like so desperately hungry for at that moment. And I was so grateful to come across that. And I remember seeing, paradigm shifts, worldview shifts really being in like her number one kind of spot. I hadn't sort of thought about it in this kind of fractal way, but of course it makes so much sense because, one of the frames I think a lot about is one that Marvin Harris talked about, which was superstructure, social structure, and infrastructure. So superstructure being kind of our worldviews, our culture, our kind of ways of being, social structure then being our economic systems, our governance systems, our laws, our regulations, and then infrastructure being kind of like our tech stack. So like the physical material world. And that all of these are essentially interacting with each other and influencing one another. And I think I've come across the work of folks, I think, who think that one is more influential or one is more dominant than the other. I think I've come to a place where I think that they're all sort of equally co-interacting, and it's probably quite difficult to really identify one as dominant. But I do feel that without these kinds of broader shifts in worldview, it's very difficult to make the changes that are needed in the social structure and infrastructure domains. And I think, we've arrived at a moment where the continued existence of life on this planet, depends partly on a major worldview shift. And I'm curious to hear kind of a bit about, I think I see pockets of these shifts happening, but I'm curious to hear if you have thoughts on how do you believe these shifts in worldview can happen at greater scale, at greater speed, and without this sort of, without the kind of like colonial domination oriented way of going about it, right? Which is just to try to say like, this is what everyone should believe and this is how everyone should operate. Yeah, just wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, you can't command and control your way into a work you about emergence, complexity, uncertainty, and interconnection. Right?
Exactly.
Can't
Right.
do that. Well, as you can imagine, I've thought about this a lot, and not from a theoretical place, but like you mentioned, this commitment to action and what do we do on the ground now, and what do we do through the destabilization we're already experiencing. Like I'll just bookmark everything about our conversation to say whatever solutions we come up with, I'm convinced we have to imagine them operating under conditions we can't imagine right now. So there's things about generalizability and improvisation that are kind of design conditions for the things that I think are worth trying. So I have two different ideas that have been helpful to me to think about worldview change. One comes from the work of Thomas Kuhn and his book on the theory of scientific revolutions, which sounds really arcane to what we're talking about. But he studied how scientific ideas change, and I think it gives us a good model for how worldviews change. So he noticed that there were long periods of science where there was kind of a consensus view of how the world worked. And then there would be results that didn't fit with that. And he called those anomalies. So we were just talking about climate change and biodiversity loss and growing inequities. To me, those are anomalies. Like if this idea of capitalism and extraction from the earth was going to produce well-being, which is what it's supposed to do, then we would be doing well. We wouldn't be having pandemics and climate disasters. So those are anomalies. And in science, the first thing that he saw happening with anomalies was they were rejected, right? That the consensus worldview was more powerful than the actual data. And that's part of our human wiring. But those anomalies, because the theory doesn't match the world, you're going to keep getting stronger and stronger anomalies. The world's always going to win over our worldview. So what happens as a few people start to accept the anomalies is they create new explanatory theories, so alternative worldviews, you could say. And the interesting thing that happens is that as the anomalies increase, the confidence in the old worldview decreases, which makes it easier to take in the anomalies. And so in systems theory, that's a reinforcing feedback loop, which really captures my interest because reinforcing feedback loops where change feeds on itself. So these are like snowballs running downhill or wildfires or going viral on the internet, right? That dynamic of from very small to picking up speed, that's what you're looking for to cause transformation, in my view. So Thomas Kuhn's work got my attention because of that potential. So what does that mean for us who are trying to help steer the systems we're in? It means that connecting anomalies to the underlying worldview helps reduce the confidence in that worldview that's not working so well, which helps hasten its demise and helps create space for alternatives. And they're not necessarily new dreams either, right? There are worldviews that have been around and are existing on Earth today. And you mentioned indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous wisdom keepers. Like that's one worldview in competition with other. There's a second reinforcing feedback loop that Thomas Kuhn identified, and that one is how alternative worldviews gain steam. And so in that case, it's when a new or it could be old but rising to prominence, a different worldview um, does a better job solving problems is the word he used. So
Really?
if there's questions that can't be answered in the current worldview, if a new worldview can answer them, that builds a confidence in the new worldview. And the interesting thing about that is that as confidence in an emerging worldview rises, there's more experiments at trying to solve problems with it, which leads to more success stories, which leads to more confidence. So you have another reinforcing loop. Can you sort of picture that, right? So the first reinforcing loop kind of takes down the old. The second reinforcing loop kind of brings up the new, and they both have the power to do that with that dynamic on a graph would look like a flat line, a sharp line up, right? That kind of transitional change. That's what reinforcing feedback does. So those are big ideas, but for me as a person, what does that mean about how I try to participate in this moment? The first one is to connect things that people would just say, like, oh, that was a disaster, right? Or, like, oh my gosh, another species is being lost. That should be a reason to have less faith in the dominant set of ideas about the purpose of a life or the purpose of an economy. So to make those connections is something that we can all do. And then the second one is to try to actually live in these other worldviews in a really practical way. Before we started recording, we were talking about the aftermath of the tropical storm across the western North Carolina, and we were talking about, people are improvising internet and improvising composting toilets and checking on neighbors. Well, that's operating out of a web of relationship paradigm, right? We actually see that emerge in these disasters. That people are taking care of each other. That is not what, capitalism and the dominant society says we're supposed to be doing, but it emerges. So in Kuhn's view of solving problems within a new paradigm, that's what I would say is happening. And part of our work as communicators and storytellers is to connect those dots that here's what happened and it's connected to this different way that we can think about our purpose and how the world works. Because a success story no one knows about and doesn't connect to a paradigm that can't feed that reinforcing feedback loop. You have to kind of connect that engine to get the exponential growth to happen.
I think one of the things that's coming to mind is um, power. There are certain power dynamics that really essentially run the world right now. We have democracies that are weakening, we have elite that are consolidating wealth and power. And those who benefit the most from the dominant worldview are typically those who have amassed large wealth and power. And they have a vested interest in that worldview continuing. And with the advent of things like advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and other types of tech that afford kind of asymmetric power in certain ways that didn't exist in the past. I guess something I've just been thinking about is how, when you have people who have enormous wealth and power vested in a particular worldview, able to, you know, put, content out in the media, in traditional media that is supportive of that dominant worldview, when you have them kind of just in positions of more power, we're in a situation where the ways in which technology has evolved, I think, has us in a kind of a different space. Like I think about some of the movements in the past, civil rights movement or other movements that have taken place and created massive change. And I wonder if that would be possible today because of there's just such a power imbalance that exists between the masses and the elite.
Well, of course, no one knows the answer to what's possible, but we try and we learn what's
Yes.
possible by trying. So, first of all, great dollops of humility thinking about that question. Of course, we know systems resist change, right? So the things you're talking about are just the latest manifestation of systems resisting change where wealth and power are concentrated. And there's two things going on. Wealth and power also buffers people from the anomalies. So at the center of power is the last place where you feel the disasters, and at the edge
Yeah.
are the first places. So even without ill will, people who are at the centers of power are the last to have the kind of tap into the collective intelligence. So that's one thing we don't necessarily fix, but we should understand. Uh, and with another dollop of humility that you and I sitting here in comfortable, safe offices on a podcast, we're pretty close to centers of power ourselves. I at
Totally.
least I'll
Yeah.
claim that for myself. So we have to know that there's things we probably don't see and understand because of that. And there should be a lot of curiosity and a lot of learning and following the leadership of people further from centers of power than us. Something I think about a lot in any of these questions of what's going to happen next or is it possible is we're now in such a period of accelerated change and we're seeing brittleness in so many places we might not have expected that I try not to assume these forces, whether they're militaries or tech companies or whatever, are as invincible and as strong and sturdy as they might look. Uh,
Mm.
I think that there's a strength in the organic, the nimble, the humble, the improvisational that's going to be more and more important the shakier everything gets. So my advice to myself, because I can, like anyone, can get scared about these big forces that we face, is don't give them more power in my mind than maybe they really have. And I guess the last thing is another important feature of multi-solving, why it really matters that we try to do it, is multi-solving unites people at the places where multiple goals rise together. And it can be really pragmatic. I remember we did a project about stormwater in Milwaukee. Our client was actually the sewer district, right? So it's not important, but like grounded, physical, real stuff. And we were looking at green infrastructure. So things like rooftop gardens and rain gardens, and chewing up pavement and putting in plants. They called it softening the city in Milwaukee, which I really liked. So at one of the meetings about softening the city, the Milwaukee Riverkeeper and the head of the Children's Asthma Coalition met for the first time because we out of towners with some computer analysis invited them together. But they realized that they had a lot of common interests, that putting more plants and softening the city would actually improve air quality for kids with asthma and would protect the health of the river. So think about that across all these issues, right? The way that having more cycling improves public health because people get physical activity, but it gets us out of cars. So there's less greenhouse gas emissions, but also less air pollution. So we're protecting kids' lungs again. And people move through the city at a slower pace. They actually have been shown that they're more economically participating with cafes and small shops. So it's an economic engine. And the current system wants all those people to be trying to solve their problems in isolation. Like, here we are working on asthma, here we are working on the river,
Yeah.
because we're all a lot weaker against the vested interests of the status quo that way. Like, you can be sure the fossil fuel industry is really glad that air pollution is studied in medical schools and climate disasters are studied in, I don't know, geology and geography departments or something. Um, it uh, accepting these arbitrary divisions in the world as real actually leaves the power in the hands of vested interests or these forces you're talking about. And understanding that there are things we can do together is one way to amass the kind of collective power needed for bigger change. So we say three things about multi-solving. Um, Most people are first attracted to it because of the bike paths or the cleaner river, like the things you can see. But two other things happen in every multi-solving project. One, we talk about rewired systems. So now there's people with relationships that didn't exist before the river got cleaned up, right? So the river's cleaner, but also the next thing that happens, whether it's an opportunity like the Biden administration is putting money into green infrastructure, but we only have 2 days to apply. Well, now people know each other and they can move into that opportunity. Or facing risks like we just had a really big shock, an economic shock, a climate shock. Again, we know each other. We can respond in different ways because you have a mailing list and I have a truck, and we can organize
Right.
volunteers that way, right? So the river's cleaner, but now there's this invisible but real rewired system, networks of relationships. And the third thing goes to our earlier conversation about worldview shifts, because people can't truly multi-solve together from the collection of objects worldview. You just can't do it.
Right.
You have to care about asthma as a climate activist to really multi-solve. You have to show up for the families with children with asthma and vice versa. So the way worldviews shift is when people inhabit them. And so even if it's for that one project and it's only Tuesday afternoon, but on Tuesday afternoon, I'm together with people and we're really seeing each other as whole beings and we're in a set of trusting relationships that we nurture and value. That's just a tiny bit of strengthening of a world of relationships worldview. And it builds a kind of muscle memory. This is what we see the social scientists on our team as they trace the stories of the impact of multi-solving. People can taste that worldview on Tuesday afternoon in one context, and they're a little different on
Yeah.
Friday in their staff meeting. And suddenly the culture of the organization is a little different. And then when we're talking about destabilization and uncertainty, um, I just saw pictures today in Black Mountain, North Carolina. We're like a week out from that climate
Yeah.
disaster. Um, like it's people gathered in the center of town for a daily meeting, because that's the only way they can communicate right now. So imagine you built consensus building skills because you worked at the food co-op as a board member in a web of relationship way of operating. You may be able to lead, in this moment where we're just improvising. What do we do next? Like there's someone who has those skills. So that muscle memory, we're practicing for what's coming, even if they're only in little pockets. And even if most of the world is still militarized and domination based and so on, doesn't mean we can't practice it in the places where we have the power to.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important point that you're making about, take the recent hurricane in the Southeast, the fact that people, and we see this in the aftermath of really any disaster anywhere in the world. You see it time and time again, where people just come together to help each other. And you look at something like that, and it does sort of point to a kind of natural human instinct or a natural human behavior in the context of when a catastrophe hits. And I think there's, some of it may go all the way back to, kind of um, Darwin's often kind of misinterpreted view of like competition and survival of the fittest, where people think that, oh no, in the context of a catastrophe, people are going to double down and just protect their own and not really come together. But on the whole, you tend to see people really coming together and helping each other. And I think I always think about that in the aftermath of a catastrophe. There's obviously immense suffering, and I'm not at all trying to downplay what people are going through there. But I also do think about what may come from this, what may emerge from this that actually leaves people and that environment in a better place than it perhaps was even before the catastrophe. And the other thing, you're sort of talking about the silos in which we work and how that's really a manifestation of this collection of objects worldview. Um, and I'm curious if you've started to see more organizations that are working on particular issues starting to come together and collaborate more, right? Like there's lots of organizations that work on climate and lots of orgs that work on education and lots that work on economic reform and yeah, we have sort of created a lot of these silos in which to solve these issues, when in reality, you can't actually approach these large crises in that way. So I'm curious if you've started to see more collaboration happening amongst those organizations, because I do think that has to be a part of our path forward. We have to start breaking down these silos. We have to start collaborating. And like you said, we have to start caring about issues that maybe aren't like top of our own personal list of issues that we care about.
Generally, yes. I think there is this growing trend. So we say multi-solving is a hidden movement. It's a hidden and growing movement. I think this is fair to say. I don't know exactly how you would prove it, but my sense after looking at a lot of multi-solving is the closer you get to the ground, the more natural it is for people to multi-solve. Mhm. And it's sort of obvious, right? In a community, you understand how the health of our kids is connected to the health of that water, which is connected to where the school is located and what the emissions from the nearby factory are. Like it's there and it's more obvious. Multi-solving also is, I think, more common um, the further you are from centers of power, like we were talking about. And that's, I think, sometimes I say the multi-slammed are the multi-solvers. Like if you're experiencing simultaneously, well, I have colleagues in Atlanta who this week were simultaneously with no power from a hurricane and trying to shelter from an industrial fire. There's a chemical haze, they were calling it, across that whole city. So, two things converging. But of course, that's also happening to people who, senior citizens are having trouble accessing medical care, or there's increasing numbers of high heat days. Like when the impacts are converging, there's something about that where people begin to find the solutions that address many impacts at once.
Mhm.
From I don't know if it's the last, another driver of more multi-solving is actually frustration. People are sometimes, they expect just lofty like idealism to drive this, but a lot of times it's that people come to the limit of what they can accomplish from within their silo. One example, a few years ago, I met a guy whose job was to fundraise for urban parks, and he was really good at it and really passionate about bringing green space and opportunities for recreation to communities that had been disinvested. And park after park, he would do that. And then what would happen is the beautiful park would happen, property values and property taxes would increase. The very people he wanted to bring green space to couldn't afford to live there anymore. They would be displaced. There'd be a wave of, it's now even has the name green gentrification. It's happening all across the country. So he realized within his silo of conservation and fundraising, like he couldn't actually live out his own values as a person from within his silo. And I met him in the context of a project that involved not just conservation, but affordable housing experts. And they began to talk about the potential to get ahead of a big development. What if we created a land trust ahead of time? Or we figured out ways to stabilize rents before we even break ground or announce the new park. So he couldn't have done that by himself. And it was frustration, I think, that was kind of the frustration is the mother of multi-solving, maybe sometimes.
I love that. Yeah.
And I guess because you're asking, is it a growing movement? Yes. And we really should name the obstacles, like how hard it is for people who are trying to work in this way. It's very difficult to fund, either with public funds or private philanthropy. So much of it is tied to show us the result you will get, right? And
Yeah.
multi-solving is both emergent. You know good things will happen from stewarding networks of relationship, but you don't always know what they will be. And you can
Or they're
almost
longer term. The
with
effect.
long
Yeah.
term, and you can almost never claim sole credit for it. So there's a huge room for funders, donors, philanthropists to embrace multi-solving. I think so much can be enabled if that happened. Then there's just the way our institutions are designed, so silos within government budgets are one really big obstacle. This might be a great breakthrough for housing and climate, but here we are in the housing department. We don't have access to that budget on climate protection.
Yeah.
Or our colleagues in the climate office are in a whole different building in a whole nother part of the city, and we don't know them. There's those kind of obstacles. It's funny, as a parent, I often say to my kids, like, the flip side of your strengths can be your weaknesses. I think there's something of that in multi-solving, like the ability to improvise and pivot when conditions change is a huge strength of multi-solving. An example I talk about a lot was I was part of a project that was giving small grants in a city for people who are working on parks. And small grants, like $5,000, got handed out right before the first COVID lockdowns happened. And so these projects had thought they were going to be working on like connecting people to their parks. They pivoted, and the relationships they had within their teams enabled them to pivot. And they did telehealth trainings on the porches of senior citizens who suddenly needed to use their phones to contact their doctors. So there's no way they could have written a grant proposal, right? Like,
Yeah.
We're going to be ready in case there's a global pandemic. Like, they couldn't have written it and no one would have funded it. But that's what happened. And so a funder who's able to say, if there are clear values, if these people have trusting relationships together and they have a direction they're moving in, that's a good investment, especially in uncertain times. But right now, that ability to pivot should be a strength, and funders should see it as a strength, but too often, I think it's a hindrance.
I think there's certainly an evolution that needs to happen in the spaces of philanthropy that starts to move towards a less ROI kind of driven decision-making process around funds, and is less about publicly demonstrating the results of their investments, because I think that's often what drives how, what gets funded is really like, what can we show? What can we say that we did with this money? And yeah, so that's certainly an area that I think needs to continue to evolve. One of the things I wanted to go back to, because it's just been something I've been curious about, is actually related to your work at Climate Interactive. So Climate Interactive created the En-ROADS climate simulator, which essentially it's this fantastic tool. It really allows anyone to kind of play around with the various factors that affect global temperatures. So you can, dial up things like conservation efforts and dial down things like fossil fuel powered energy or population growth. And it was one of the first tools that for me really helped me to understand more concretely how radical the shifts are, how radical the shifts needed are in terms of the actual impact on global temperatures. Like I remember playing around with the tool being like, how does this change things 0.01 degree? Like what? And one of the things I was curious about, and maybe the tool has changed because it's been a couple of years since I looked at it, but one of the things I was really curious about is why economic growth wasn't one of the factors that you could sort of dial up or dial down, because we know that economic growth has a clear impact on climate change and ecosystems, and that our economies cannot grow forever on a finite planet. So I was just curious about why that wasn't something that you could play around with. And perhaps it's like built into the model in other ways, but it's just been a question I've had on my mind. So I wanted to ask you while I have you here.
I don't know which version you saw, but it is a lever. It may not be called economic growth. I think it might be called GDP growth or something. So it may not have
Oh,
shown
okay.
up the way you expected to see it. But both population growth and economic growth um, are two things that do change the climate outcomes. And certainly today, if you go to En-ROADS, you'll see
Okay.
them. Yeah.
Okay. I must have seen an older version. I don't know if you're still in touch with folks, but obviously economic growth is a tough topic for some people to talk about, and a lot of people don't want to touch that topic. Um, and I'm just curious if having, any conversations that have happened with governments or large philanthropies that have interacted with the tool, like have you seen that kind of contribute to shifts in the ways that people are thinking about the role of economic growth?
Well, maybe even just broaden that beyond climate interactive and just, I think the interesting question is this deep into climate change. Like, are we making progress on that conversation seeded by the limits to growth in
Yeah.
1972? You know, that we can have all kinds of growth when growth is development, growth of ideas, growth of well being, but growth of physical throughput of energy and materials is just not feasible forever on a finite planet. And I'm honestly kind of shocked this many years into my career that that isn't more of a widespread conversation, that it seems to exist in this now there's this kind of parallel channel, it sometimes feels like the degrowth
Yeah.
movement or some great scholarship, but and this isn't my day-to-day work, so I don't have a sense of all the ins and outs, but I think it is a struggle to connect that in to the mainstream conversation. It gets complicated or confused in that sense of, lots of people talk about decoupling, right? So that there's ways in which if you can make an economy more and more efficient, then it could grow under current definitions of economic growth without as much harm. Which so that, those are good things to pursue. We're sort of drawn back to worldviews again, right? Like if the core of your economic worldview is this whole system can't operate without growth, and yet the planet has the last
Yeah.
word, and the planet is like, well, we can't sustain growth forever. Like, which is going to give way, right? That's sometimes I say, like, what's more important, a worldview or a world? And yet it is pretty stunning how hard it is for people to let go of worldviews, even in order to save the world.
Yeah.
And you brought up fair enough that there are a lot of vested interests who have a lot to lose under a different economic system. So it's not like it's just this even-handed thought puzzle. Actually, there are actors that are skewing the conversation. Um, and even in democracies, I mean, people get really discouraged sometimes about, quote, human nature or something like that. I hear that a lot. Like, people will never change. We're always selfish. Look what the United States is voting for now, and really neglecting like decades at this point of voter suppression and, changing the voting districts towards a particular outcome, or money in politics ever since Citizen United. Like, the net output of our democracy is not actually a measure of what people want or what people
Yeah.
understand. And it's not a measure of human nature. And then the way we're all conditioned to behave in late stage capitalism and its institutions, our like typical American upbringing, that's not a representation of human nature either. Like, most societies on this planet for most time have not subscribed to a lot of these
Yeah.
assumptions. So, people get confused between what can change and what can't change, and they start to think that worldviews can't change or how people are can't change. When the things that can't change are like planetary physics, like the impact of a doubling of CO2 on temperature, like that's not within our power to change. But how an economy works is just a made up bunch of ideas.
Yeah.
Someone made them up and someone else could change them.
Even just like a cursory review of history can show you the things that we have the power to change, because you see other cultures that existed that have operated in different ways with different systems. And you look at, the sort of, I mean, if you really think about it, the sort of modern nation state and capitalist economic system is like 400 years old. That's like nothing. That's like a blip in the time span of humanity. And when you put it into that perspective, then it kind of changes what you think about what's possible to change. Because I absolutely agree with you. I talk to many people who I would say kind of fall into a more kind of progressive, wanting systems change camp, but they often kind of say like, oh, well, that's never going to change.
Ugh.
And I'm like, I don't know. Take a look at history and you can kind of see that things have changed. This hasn't been in place forever. I'm curious, when I think about systems change work, I think I view it really as about creating the conditions for emergence. And I'm curious, after your many decades of work in various areas, what do you see emerging now? Like, I'm curious if you have a sense, and maybe it's not even something that have kind of like research or evidence for. Maybe it's something that you're sort of like feeling within your body. But I'm curious if you're sort of sensing any kind of shifts happening.
Yeah. Well, this may not be totally heartening. Um, but I was asked this question recently, and I found myself answering by asking people to picture two concentric circles. And inside the first circle, I would put all the things we can change to, say, address climate change without really addressing worldviews, power relations, how economic systems work. And actually, within that circle, I think there's tremendous momentum and really amazing
Mm,
change happening, right? You see all
yeah.
the exponential growth curves or the falling price of solar or the number of electric vehicles. And so if you talk to people who live within that world of what's possible within what exists, those people are on fire. They're working so hard. They're accomplishing so much. And so if you'd say, how's it going? They'd say, incredible. We just need more money, more people. Let's go.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's another circle, and I hang out in this one, and I think maybe you do, that's like the circle of what's needed. Because, of course, if we could plug the current society into clean energy by snapping our fingers, it's not a great society for a lot of people. There's so much poor health, there's so much inequity. And it's not just climate, right? It's water, it's biodiversity, it's nitrogen, it's phosphorus. We know all the limits. And so the outer circle is what we actually need to survive and thrive. And maybe I the last interview found me on a kind of pessimistic day, but I was like, it feels like the rate of change in that circle is still really, really, really slow relative
Mm.
to the inner circle. I feel like a lot of these ideas of we should orient the economy around well-being, we should walk away from GDP. I was a baby sustainability person at Donella Meadows Foot 30 years ago, and people were saying that and writing articles about it. So when I think about that, I think about we were talking about the reinforcing feedback loop and what the behavior that produces is,
Mhm.
which is potentially a really, really long time of a very flat line that suddenly shoots upward. And you only know that it's not going to be flat forever in retrospect after you've experienced it shooting upward. So what I tend to think and why I keep working as hard as I work in the outer circle is that's right. 30 years since I've been doing it and people before me, like those ideas were formed. They weren't just brand new when I discovered them. That's what it's like sometimes when you're trying to get reinforcing feedback loops or transformative change to happen. It's like nothing happens,
Yeah.
and nothing happens. But the snowball is very slowly gaining momentum. And so you don't know if your little push to the snowball is going to matter or going to be enough. But you do know if you're not pushing it and no one else is, like, that's the only certainty. If you don't try, it will never happen.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. The sort of concept of tipping points, um, I think is an interesting.
yeah, the tipping points aren't only out there to scare us in the
Yeah.
environmental space, they're tipping points in our own understanding, there's tipping points in collective behavior. Courage begets courage, ideas beget ideas,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And can I say one last thing about emergence? Because you mentioned
Yeah.
emergence and creating the conditions for emergence is what you said. Um, so I think I would just 100% agree, underscore what you're saying. And certainly whatever chunk of my career remains is pretty much what it's devoted to, is creating the conditions for emergence. My understanding of emergence is that it's actually the only source of innovation in systems. It's for a system to have a new behavior, you have to create new connections within it. So
Mhm.
emergence is based on connections. It's why H2O has very different behavior than hydrogen and oxygen, right? It's not water isn't in the hydrogen, water isn't in the oxygen. It's the connections between the hydrogen and the oxygen. What's possible in Milwaukee is in the connection between the Riverkeeper and the Asthma Coalition. It's not in either of them. So I would say e- everything, might be an overstatement, but not by much. Everything I do, why I wrote the book, what Multisolving Institute tries to do is to create these to support, because they're already happening. We're not creating them, but to support people rewiring themselves into new networks, right? Because that's where
Yeah.
emergence comes from. That's where novelty comes from. And I think it's the only thing I can see to invest in with so much uncertainty about the future. Like, it's a no regrets investment as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned. It's going to be there when we need it in the darkest moments, those connections, and they're going to be there to create the new things, the new ideas, the new possibilities. And you don't have to know which it is or what's coming to know that that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So, our tools, if you go to our website at multisolving.org, our tools, they're apps and they look like they're to support good conversations and to lead to smarter projects. And they are, but they're really designed for conversations that build trust, where people understand each other's needs and where they intersect. And like the happiest thing will be if at the end of the day, 2 people or 20 people used a tool of ours and they're more connected to each other than they were before, and some silos have crumbled a little bit.
Right.
That's my investment in the future. So just to endorse your intuition, I feel the same.
I think back to there was a point a couple of years ago where I felt as I was coming to see how all our crises are entangled, and as I was coming to understand that, taking an action in one place sets off a cascade of other things that some of which are perceptible to me and some of which would never be perceptible to me. I I almost felt paralyzed, like I felt really fearful of taking any action in the world because I was afraid of like, well, even though I have the best of intentions and I'm trying to create, I'm trying to do good in the world, what if the thing I do actually ends up being disastrous and it causes more problems? And I think ultimately what brought me back and able to kind of continue doing the work I do is to think about that, the relationships, the connections, the nurturing of that felt to me like you couldn't really go wrong by continuing to support that because that, like you said, that is where the emergence comes from. Without those connections, without the relationality, we can't create something new. It's got to come from something different. Otherwise, we're just sort of replicating the ways of being in the world that exists now. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading your book, Multisolving, and thank you for the advance copy. I was very appreciative of receiving that. But one of the things I was thinking about is when you were writing, there's a section where you sort of write about vision and about having a vision before you kind of embark on a new project. And so, to have sort of a developed picture of the world that you want to see. And I I certainly see the benefits of that, but I also wonder if there's sort of a danger wrapped up in that, which is that, our visions are inevitably constrained by our current perception of the world, which is really a microcosm of all of reality. And so, yeah, and so in many ways our visions unintentionally replicate the past. And so I'm curious what you might say about that because I find there's this sort of tension and kind of fine line between envisioning something different and taking action towards it versus, and I'm not saying that there's like a polarity or like you either envision something or you don't do any planning or any visioning and you just go out and do, but I'm just wondering about like how those kind of come together.
Yeah. Well, my first teacher about visioning, as in so many things, was actually Donella Meadows, who told me once she never started anything, a new garden, a book, the community where I live now, without first doing a formal visioning session, which for her was closing her eyes and imagining what it would look, smell, feel, be like. And I think you're right that you can't envision what you don't have an experience of yet, or it's hard. So, a couple things about that. One is I think our imaginations feed each other. And I think there are artists and writers, and I think about, Grist runs a climate fiction contest
For
now.
sure.
So those people are help in imagining what we haven't actually experienced. And I think that finds its way into our visions. But the other thing Danella taught, and I found this to be true myself, is you envision it and that's great. And then you go forward with no expectations about how it's going to happen or actually how it's really going to look.
Right.
So for me, one example of that is um, my husband Phil and I, many years ago, did a formal visioning session while we were living in Boston. We didn't have children. We said we wanted to live in a place where we could teach sustainability and where our hoped for children could be connected to nature. And we had no idea how we would get there. But actually, we ended up taking jobs with Donella Meadows because a few years later, she called and she said, I'm starting an institute. I'd love to have you. And I'm starting a community. I'd love to have you. And she said, I have 6 months of job security. Like I have a grant. It's for and by that time, we did have a baby and we had a mortgage, and it was half the salary we were earning for 6 months. And we said yes.
Yeah.
And there are parts that we saw in that vision that never happened, and parts we never imagined that did happen, and I'm not working for Janella, and that life intervened. And 2 companies later, I couldn't have predicted Multisolving. There's a lot that I envisioned in the community I live in that never happened, and a lot of surprises that other people, like right now, one of my neighbors is creating a labyrinth on what used to be the soccer field, right? My vision didn't have a labyrinth, but it got me here to connect with this guy who only moved here a year ago, So for me, it's a funny, I don't think we can constrain our visions even if we wanted to. And I don't think our limited imaginations will hold us back because life is going to just, you know, put that all in a blender anyways. And if you can surf with it. And for me, the vision gave me courage. That's to take a leap that I probably wouldn't have taken without it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you actually brought up the eco village in Vermont where you live, because I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit, because I know you raised your children in a small, tight-knit community. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, I have a 6-year-old, and I've just been thinking a lot about what I can be doing now to prepare him for this sort of world that is coming for obviously, like we've been talking about, we can't predict exactly what's coming, but we do have a sense that there are certain crises that are getting worse and exacerbating. And so I've been thinking about this question, like, how do we raise and educate children today that will be capable of navigating through these crises and working towards the transformation of the world that we all want to see on the other end. And so I'm just curious about, what you think about the sort of upbringing in this sort of tight-knit eco-village community most prepared them for the world that's coming.
Well, you should interview them someday.
So, that would be interesting. Get your perspective and then get their perspective.
Yeah, I mean, every family is an experiment of one, right?
Yeah.
So our kids grew up with climate scientist parents. They also grew up homeschooled for a lot of the time, partly because of the way they seem to naturally want to learn. We felt like we could facilitate that differently, mostly outdoors, to be honest. And yeah, they grew up with a bunch of friends their same age. So where most kids that I see, now parents are like scheduling a play date. When our kids were little, we had to schedule family day, right? Like you actually, you can't go run off with your 6 other friends all day and we don't know where you are. Like today we're doing something together as a family. So it maybe gives a little flavor of the difference of it. And our kids were very connected to where their food came from, because part of the experiment here is a lot of different farming and animal husbandry. One of my daughters right now works on a dairy farm. The other one has her own small homestead. So some of that, they kind of picked up and ran with. One is a photographer, songwriter, homesteader, and one is a chef. And they have a cookbook coming out in a year.
Amazing.
Yeah, one invented the recipes, one took the photos, and it's all the recipes can be made with ingredients that can be grown in Vermont, like literally to the, no sugar, no olive oil. Like they were very strict, yet it's beautiful, almost gourmet food. I feel like I'm winding around, but maybe the punchline would be neither kid chose to go to college. Actually, they took off on their careers through different paths than that. So you have 2 PhD scientists, parents, right? And then what's really exciting, we're so proud of their vibrant lives. So maybe it's a little bit like visioning too. Like no matter how you're going to raise your kid, they're their kid and they're their person, And so it's some alchemy of what you expose them to and who they are and what they're meant to be and what the times are calling forth from people. So I don't think what am I trying to say? I don't think there's any magic in the eco village of it, I have a friend who lives in Manhattan and they just electrified their co-op and they don't have a car and their kids get everywhere on bikes and scooters, like throughout the whole city. Like so different from how my kids were raised, but some of those same attributes of independence and creativity and like they're living in the climate future too. So I don't know. I think it's just you're grappling with it and your kid's going to grapple with it with you. And that's probably all you need to do.
I love that example of the city because Yeah, I think sometimes we can get caught up in this idea of like, oh, well, if we're not like raising them on a farm or something, then we're doing like some major detriment to their
Yeah.
development. Yeah, and I suppose, I before I came to doing this work, I worked in education and was, was really thinking a lot about educational systems change and feeling very much that um the for the most part, our dominant education system in the West is really not kind of keeping pace with the times and not really preparing children to think in ways that are systemic, that is going to be even more important as we continue down the next several decades in particular. And yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if you've, at the Multisolving Institute, if you've partnered with any education organizations or anything, but I'm just curious to see if you've been seeing any kind of shifts happening in the education space.
I feel like we connect a little bit more with post-secondary educators. So lots of college professors use our tools and activities, and seem really excited about helping their students kind of look across all the disciplines and figure out where they meet. I had a great fun. I was invited by someone at an experiential high school that's based on a farm to talk about multi-solving, and those students blew me away with the connections that they were making. And I'm sure that it's trickling down to earlier stages of education. And I know just how constrained so many teachers are right now by, what their either a curricula and standards that they need to fit into or other pressures on them. So it's really hard work. And I think it's hard to do, maybe hard to do innovative things there too sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think it kind of goes back to when you scale large systems and put kind of standard rules in place, it makes it very difficult for emergence to happen because you're kind of in a very constrained environment. So you have the sort of more smaller independent schools that are, more able to experiment and try different things, whereas like large public district schools, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, and this really isn't my area of expertise, but there's so much exciting potential too. I know there's like a green new deal for schools idea coming from some in Congress that would simultaneously improve air quality for pollution and for infectious disease, would get, schools with solarized and battery backup, and they could be resilience hubs for communities.
Yeah.
And, I just think about the hands-on learning for kids in that process. So it feels like sometimes we're just like a half a degree away from just amazing possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which I
And
would
one,
work with the and but it's not my day-to-day world either.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. We're getting close to the end of our conversation, and I wanted to actually try out a new question on you, a new closing question that I'm playing around with a little bit, which is if you had one penny to throw into the water fountain and make a wish in the service of the sacredness of life, what would your one wish be for?
I'm gonna think about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm surprised by what came to me, but I'll say it. I'll share it. So I'm in a personal situation right now where it required me and another person to let go of a lot of expectations. And I have been saying this almost in mantra at my meditation every night of like opening and softening and releasing what no longer serves. And
Mm.
like wishing that for me and hoping that would be helpful to the other person. And so when you ask the question, the wish I had is actually for all of us for that opening and softening and releasing of what no longer serves. My friend Susie Moser says she all works in the space of climate adaptation. And I've often heard her say, we can't do the new things that need to be done until we stop doing the old things that are causing harm.
Mm.
And I've been feeling that more and more like I think the innovation is bubbling up, and part of what's in the way is just this fearful holding on to what has been, even if it's not serving. So I wish for me, for you, if you like the idea, for everyone, just that releasing of what's no longer serving, that the new can come in.
Mm. I love that. And that's a wonderful reminder. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Elizabeth, my last question for you. Who would you like to platform on this podcast?
I actually would love to. I don't know how you would do this, but I'd love to platform a network. There's a network called the Liminality Network. It's tended by people actually all over the world and participated in by people all over the world. My main connection and introduction to it is through a Cher Miller at Forthcoming Institute, but he's just one of several stewards. But it is, a nod to the liminal space, the transitions between what has been and what's coming, and it's people who are working in that space. But many from the global south. So when you and I were talking about learning and turning to the leadership that's farther from centers of power, it's a rich place for that. So there's dozens of people there you should talk with, or maybe there's like a group podcast day. I don't know. I think it could be fascinating.
Oh, wonderful. I love that. Yeah, I'm familiar with the Post-Carbon Institute, but I had not heard of the Liminality Network, so excited to look into that. And yeah, I absolutely agree. One of the things I'm attempting to do on this podcast is really broaden the platform of voices that are typically talking about this stuff. And so inviting, more women, more people of color, more people from the global south, just trying to get a variety of perspectives, because I think it is so important to, I think oftentimes we're talking about such big picture issues that are really like hyper objects. Like they're just difficult to grasp, and it's often I don't think it serves any of us to be doing that work completely disconnected from the realities on the ground. And so making sure that we're sort of bridging the two is important. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a kind of time traveling that can happen when you do that. And by that, I mean, the further we are from whatever the center is, the earlier we experienced the damages, the collapse, the loss, So if your ancestors were part of the transatlantic slave trade, like you have a long history of what this is about and of ways to cope. And if you're an indigenous person in a colonized place, so there's also, much to learn by people who've been grappling with this for a lot longer than me.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This was lovely. If you liked the episode and want to hear more conversations where we explore how a more beautiful world might emerge, subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app or the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. If you loved it, support the project at patreon.com/Entangled World. Thank you for listening and for coming on this journey together.